Moving on to the second panel of the evening, we have with us Tess Lewis and Clara Nubile, along with Ranjit Hoskote, who will talk about translation in the European context. Our first panelist, Tess Lewis, is a writer and translator of French and German. She has been awarded translation grants from PEN USA and PEN UK, an NEA Translation Fellowship, and a Max Gellinger Translation Grant. She is also the recipient of the ACFNY Prize for her translation of the novel Angel of Oblivion by the Austrian writer Maya Hederlap, and most recently a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship to translate Notizen, the Swiss writer Ludwig Hohl's magnum opus. She serves as an advisory editor for the Hudson Review, and her essays have appeared in publications such as World Literature Today, The Wall Street Journal, The American Scholar, and Book Forum. Our next panelist, Clara Nubile, is a writer and literary translator and currently teaches Italian language and culture at the Bombay University. Her translations into Italian include Life of Pi, The Everest Hotel, and Mumbai Fables. She has published 3 novels and a collection of short stories, in addition to various essays. In 2014, she published a collection of poems set in Mumbai. Ranjit Hoskote, who will be moderating the session, is a leading Anglophone Indian poet and has been acclaimed as a seminal contributor to Indian art criticism. Poet, cultural theorist, and curator, he is the author of 30 books, including Vanishing Acts, New and Selected Poems, Central Time, and I, Lala, the Poems of Lal Dead. With Ilya Troyanov, he has co-authored Confluences, and with Maria Lavajova, he co-edited Future Publics, a critical reader in contemporary art. He has co-curated the 7th Gwangju Biennale in 2008 and was curator of India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2011. And he is the co-curator of the literature section at the Kala Ghoda Festival. Thank you.
Khurshid, thank you so much for those words of welcome. And it really is a very special privilege and a pleasure to be here in conversation with Tess Lewis and Clara Nubile. We did say that we would be talking about translation in Europe, but since Europe is now in rather interesting circumstances wide open to the world, we're really going to be talking about translation in the world. But there might be very specific questions that have to do with linguistic textures within European languages. But I just want to begin by welcoming both of you and thanking you for participating in this conversation. I like to usually say that I have 6 rounds, which makes it all sound formidably structured. It'll probably all melt down as we go along. But I'm going to just begin with a few framing thoughts. I just want to... I'm so sorry. This is what I usually rebuke other people for. I'm going to begin by pointing out the fact that there's a central paradox to the translator's predicament. On the one hand, there is the efficacy of what the translator does. It's evident in the text. But there's also, at the same time, a certain invisibility. There's a way in which the translator's labor is sublimated into the translated text. So how might a translator indicate that presence? What are the choices we might infer? So that's going to be a thread that I will sort of explore and share with, and I hope you'll respond to some of the questions that emerge from that. I also want to say that, you know, for many of us in the Anglophone world, in a certain generation, when we thought we were reading Dostoevsky as we were growing up, it was actually Constance Garnett. Or when we all woke up one fine day to find that Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude was in print in English. That was actually Gregory Rabassa we were reading. And so on and so forth. So it's just a way of signaling to the fact that there is this invisible, often undercompensated, unacknowledged labor that we might usefully want to think about as we go along. Yeah? Also, I think we'll course over ground that is familiar to all translators, but it's a renewal of crisis each time you face a text. Practice versus theory, decisions versus the limits of translation, transparency of text versus the explanatory apparatus that you might want to bring to it. And I've been thinking, just in the last few days, because I've been working with a naughty translation, that language in some way is a habit, it's a habitat, it's a home. And in many ways, what translation encourages us to do is to work against the grain of that habit and to make us aware once again of precisely in what ways translation and language through translation might offer some kind of home. Yeah? So also it strikes me that habit and habitat and habitus all have a common Latin root, and it's a haptic root. It speaks to habere, which is to have, to possess. So I'm going to really dive in now and ask both of you how language in translation is for you a way of possessing or making your own the texts that you address. What kind of desire do you have as a translator? And Tess, I'll begin with you because you work with French and German and you bring texts over into English. What were the forms of desire and curiosity that impelled your work as a translator?
I worked, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Ranjit, for moderating this event. Translation is an impossible, it's the art of the impossible, actually. You can do quite a few translations that are right. You can also do translations that are wrong, but there's no one translation that's right. While, you know, my desire in doing a translation is always to aspire to the best, the right, the only possible right translation. It's never going to happen, that's clear. Instead, as a more practical level, what I try to do is hear the sound of the voice, of the writer's voice, and try to capture both the sound of the voice and recreate it as faithfully as I can, rhythmically, lyrically, in terms of allusions and metaphors, textual structure, in English. With the different languages, I have different possibilities and different techniques. With the French, because English is so influenced, it has two, basically we have our Germanic vocabulary and our Latinate. After the Norman conquest, English language expanded exponentially, and there are two very different registers with the Latinate and the Germanic vocabularies. And so I find that when I'm translating from a French text, I could easily just stick with the Latinate, and it makes it sort of, makes it more intellectual, more distanced. The Anglo-Saxon words, the Germanic Anglo-Saxon words are always much more earthy, powerful, and rustic. So I can vary the tone. The French like to be abstract in their own way, different from the German abstraction. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that I try to use the resources both of the source language and the target language to recreate the various texts and with all their idiosyncrasies as best as I can. And just one more desire that brought me to translation. I worked for many years as an editor, 20 years. My first translation I did in 1998, but it was on the side while I was an editor. And then I found that by the discipline and the rigor of translation makes you enter and possess, actually, and understand a text in a completely different way, a more internal way. And that's been one of the fulfilled desires that I've experienced in translation, when so many are unfulfilled.
It's lovely. Clara, could I turn to you?
Good evening, everybody, and thanks again for inviting me here. For me, I started translating in 1999, and the first thing was my desire to bring India to Italy, because I was traveling here and got some books, and then in English, and I wanted to translate them in Italian, and I managed. In the end, I managed. So for me, it was a way of just bringing India and describing in a way. Of course, it was very difficult at the beginning because there is a huge gap in culture, in language, and every time I translate, I have the feeling that there are many mirrors around me. It's tough, it's challenging, and you realize how the language is changing. Of course, you create your own habitat, your own home inside the translation, but you have to be very careful when and how to step inside that home. And for me, in all these years, I've been translating Indian authors. So again, you have the cultural references, and then sometimes you shift to houses which are not so comfortable to you. Like all of a sudden, I shift to kids literature, and for me was totally a different land, a different territory. And again, you have to adapt the perception of the language and of your own language, because language is always changing, and you have this feeling in when you translate.
This kind of leads me to another kind of question, which has to do with the research that goes into translation, the process of preparation. I tend to be a little suspicious of translation theory, having gone through that grind academically, but the one thing that I find for
It was a huge challenge in one way because of the breadth of his interests, the breadth of his readings, his allusions to various mythologies, from ancient mythologies to more recent, Nazi mythology or their usurpation of mythologies. He would quote writers in various languages, in Greek, because he was studying Greek for a while, and in French, and some things he would quote from translations of other texts. So it was an immense challenge to translate him, both for the knowledge that he assumes in his reader. So I would have to double check his sources. Sometimes he would quote from memory, which meant it was completely mangled in the actual page. So I had to make the decision, do I translate what he remembers, because that's what influenced his work, or do I go back to the original source? Say he was quoting at length a book about executions in preparation for his work, the Women of the Revolution, where he created various beds thematically tied to women involved in the French Revolution, both heroines and problematic women, the executed, the activists, etc. He was all over the place. I could often not find the source. Sometimes he remembered something, it was actually from another book. And I thought, well, he wasn't copy edited by his German publisher, so I should probably stick to the notebook, as a working exercise. Sometimes there would be endnotes explaining that, this is actually from another book, or this happened. But I spent 2 years on it, actually, not full-time, but 2 years doing background reading, going to Anselm Kiefer exhibits, reading books by him and about him. What made it easier is that his imagination and his inspiration is always very cyclical. So things that he was working on in 1998-99, which is the volume that I translated, were reappearing in shows that I was seeing in 2014, 2015. So it was actually like entering the time warp of his brain, and that was exciting, but exhausting.
It's a wonderful way of putting it, the time warp of his brain. I'm going to take that thought to you, Clara, because you've translated Andrew Lane's Young Sherlock Holmes series, so that's entering another kind of time warp. What was your process of preparation like in dealing with, what do Holmesians tell us? Baring Gould says that Holmes was probably born in 1854 or 56. So what was it like going back into that Victorian moment?
Yeah, it was very interesting, first of all, because I love this time traveling while translating. But at the same time, you have to do a lot of background researches, and you need references. And at that point, you understand that all the theory you went through during my university year, I did MA in translation studies, and it was quite theoretical. When you start translating, you realize that you don't have any theoretical references. You just need sources, and you need also people around you who can help you with in other fields. And when I was doing this Sherlock Holmes series, I was just trying to get the flavor of the language, but at the same time it has to be modern because it was for kids. So it was a way of combining the flavor of the time with the language, which was simple and immediate for the readers in Italy, the young readers in Italy. And again, you see that the work we do, there is a lot behind the translation. It's not only the language, it's the culture, it's the mentality. There are so many things, And in this, we are really invisible, I think, because the work is so huge. And it's enriching, of course, because you learn so many things, but at the same time, you have to you have a big, it's really big, and you have to make it small. And it's not always easy, because then you have deadlines, and time is never enough, I think, to have a good translation.
Kind of sets me thinking of something Franco Moretti came up with a few years ago, which he called distant reading, as against close reading, which is attentiveness to the text. I mean, I love his scholarly work, but this was a slightly crackpot scheme of taking texts from a certain date to another date and to put all of them through some kind of computerized ringer, so that they emerged, out of this emerged a whole lot of historical and sociological detail. So I don't know how you as translators and as writers respond to that approach. The close, intimate attention to the text, and then because of these questions of context we're discussing, the grand machine of Moretti. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this? Have you wrestled with it?
I think that it's, like theory, it's interesting from a linguistic point of view, but from a practical point of view, I think that it offers very limited results. And you lose the music of the text, the rhythm, and the circular thinking or the circular presentation. And so I find it maybe interesting as one aspect of the text, but not helpful at all as a tool or a way to approach translation, for me.
Yeah, I agree with this. And when before you were telling that you hear voices, there is a voice, there are voices in books, and then if you're a writer, maybe it's easier. I find easier to hear this voice as a writer, but when you translate, it's really, really tough, because again, you have to put a distance between yourself as a writer and yourself as a translator, and again, the text itself. And yes, theories can be interesting from a linguistic point of view. Of course, they are so interesting. But when you are doing the real job, then every time is different. Of course, every time is different because translations are different. And when it happened to me to read one of my first translations, and I was telling, it's not me, it's not me, and it's really.
That kind of leads me to think of, you've both of you referred to this role, you've implied the role of the translator as a builder of bridges in a certain way. You're building bridges between languages, between cultures, and neither languages nor cultures are really static. They're constantly shifting. They're shifting in tonality, they're shifting in the milieu you're looking at, the period. So I wonder if I might invite you to look at very specific questions. And Tess, I'll begin with you again. You know, we use these words very easily. We talk of something called German, but apart from the Hannover Hochdeutsch, which is standard, I mean, in the whole of Mittel Europa, there are various Germans. I mean, Swiss German, the kind of German spoken in Austria, what's spoken in different parts of Germany. How does that question play out in the way you translate? When you're looking at different kinds of authors from these places, the extent to which they allow for regional inflection, or if you're dealing with authors far apart in time, like Alois Hutschnig or Josef Roth. Could you talk to us about this?
It's, even though I say I translate from German, I have only translated now two actual German writers, and one is not even a writer, he's a painter. Most of my translations are of Austrian and Swiss writers. So to the extent that those different kinds of the German language influence me, it's my preference. I find that Austrian is far more musical than German, and the German that's spoken in Switzerland also, to me, has a different inflection that I find fascinating and charming, far more charming than German. This is not a reflection on the quality of the text, it's just what I respond to personally. And I think you have to have a personal response to a text and to the way a language is used in order to do justice to it. That said, there's a third complication, and Ilya Troyanov could speak to this. The German literary publishing world and the German language in general, it seems, is far more hospitable to writers who started speaking a different language. Their maternal tongue, or they're writing in German as a second language. Most of them came to German in their teens, some later. And I've translated quite a few of these. A Swiss writer, Melinda Najabonyi, who first is Hungarian. Maya Haderlap's first language was Slovenian. And that's a third wrinkle where I have to try to capture the echoes of the original language in a particular kind of German. So how do I catch Hungarian intonations, word order, wordplay, idiomatic expressions that her characters use in in an English that is supposed to show somehow that it's trying to recreate Swiss inflected German. And basically it's impossible. I have a few strategies that I hope work. Most of them are sound or rhythm based. Humor is another issue that's so closely tied with language. And the three kinds of German language, or Germans, whatever, nationalities, have approaches to humor that are completely different. I would say Austrian humor is the most linguistically sophisticated. Germans, to me, their German humor, it tends more to the slapstick, so creating awkward tensions or funny physical situations, social situations. The Swiss have an irony that is not as biting and as caustic as the Austrian, but effective in its own way. And that's another art of the impossible that I hope I master somehow, but I'm not quite sure. I try to improve with every book.
Clara, I'm going to bring the same question to you. Questions of shade, of tonality, and the different locations that... well, I'm going to say it was fashionable in Commonwealth discourse at one point to talk about Englishes rather than a singular English. And, you work with the Anmatel, for instance, or Paramhansa Yogananda, the collected works, which is another time, another period, another style.
Another style. That was also very interesting, because when I was translating Yogananda into Italian, again, the English is very different and the style is unique. And sometimes I was just trying to understand clearly, and the Italian was very different from the Italian I use every day. And somehow it was Yogananda's Italian in a way. I managed to do this, because when he's telling stories, when he's trying to give, when he's transmitting wisdom, I say I can't change. I have to keep this structure, which was sometimes in English was also a bit funny to me. So I kept it, and again, there are several Englishes, and Italian is a language, which is mainly one. Then we have several dialects and a lot of nuances, but again, you have to be very careful how to choose. If we have certain characters, you can use some words, and then you can describe the characters in a way which immediately the Italian reader will understand something. But it can be adapted to the original text. And when I was translating Jan Martel, of course, it was another story, and again there were so many cultural references to India, but it was done brilliantly in the original version. So for us, it's easier. If the original text is brilliant, then it's much, much easier. But this Yogananda experience is interesting because of the language. And again, it's another time. It's like being suspended somewhere, and it's not real in a way, no?
This is also kind of circling around the question of the limits of translation. And sometimes there are just words that come from histories that are unshareable or sometimes possibly even unbearable, but they have a certain valency in where they come from. But how do you carry that across? I mean, thinking here of, Pamuk has spoken of huzun, for instance, in Istanbul, or we often think of the word zamin, which is not really translated. You famously in an interview have spoken of another word that many of us who are preoccupied with German culture are are wary of Heimat. So could I invite you to talk about that moment in translation where the word really defies transmission?
Heimat is my worst nightmare. Because it comes up again and again, not in Swiss literature, but in German and Austrian, certainly. And it's weighted, historically fraught, and authors, when they use it very consciously in a certain way to create a mood, to send a message, to say something about the character. One of the books I translated is a novel set in Carinthia, the southern province of Austria, and the word Heimat came up again and again. And it's the story of betrayal of one neighbor betrays another to the Nazis, and the Austrians' village's decision sort of to engage in collective amnesia. They didn't want to know what's going on. They pretended they didn't know for years afterwards. So depending on who in the book uses the word Heimat, it means something poisonous or something nostalgic or something, delusional. My only solution was to try and find equivalents and use those equivalents very judiciously and selectively to hopefully render some of the mood. So whether it was homeland or fatherland or native country or your own place or your region. So much got lost in that decision, but the only other thing I could have done was to leave Heimat, and that wasn't a solution either. Which, some of these untranslatable terms, translators do choose to just leave them. They'll explain them once and then just recycle it through the text, and I think that's a defensible position. It's just not one that I've used to this point.
Clara, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to add to that a question that has to do with, let's call it the Italian reception of India. I mean, this sounds vast, but there are probably, I'm imagining that there are different filters of, for lack of another word, Orientalism, through which India has historically become available to Italian readers or viewers or consumers of culture. So when you translate from Anglophone writers in India, for instance, how does this play out? What are the cultural assumptions that you feel your readers would understand, or do you feel that there are moments when this might slip over into exotica, or how do you deal with that problem?
Yeah, the risk is there. The risk is there that things may slip into exotica or Orientalism. But for example, there are things which I think there are many similarities between India and Italy. We are kind of drama queens in a way, both countries. This is my opinion, and I'm very fond of India, and I'm very fond of my country, of course. And everything which is cultural, in a way, can be transmitted. But for me, the most difficult part was translating historical terms. When I was doing Gyan Prakash Mumbai Fables, there was this saffronization of Bombay. How to translate it in Italian? I knew, and I was in Bombay. I mean, I have the feeling of the word, but I couldn't express it in Italian. And that was really a challenge. And how to explain and translate, not to explain, how to translate communalism. We don't have that in Italy. All these concepts, big concepts, and you also have to be responsible, because it's not fiction, it's non-fiction, it's the historical context, it's full of meanings, and there are nuances, and you are talking about a city which underwent a big change. And so for me that was really challenging, because of course you have to explain and translate in a way. So again, I was finding a way. And one color, saffron, it means a lot. But for us, saffron, it's nothing. I mean, it's just a color and not so popular. So that was really interesting and really challenging. And again, you are a kind of, it's like you are to find solution like a magician immediately, and then see if they work. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But of course, you put all your effort and you try.
Speaking to the magic of the translated text, there's one kind of translator who believes that the text should do its own hard work. And that kind of translator, I'm setting up a straw man here, but tends to be cautious about the apparatus. of introduction, afterward, glossary, and all of this. But I'm going to ask both of you the same question. Where do you stand on this issue? Would you regard that as useful, or does it get in the way?
I never use footnotes. I think that's too much of a distraction. But often we have no say, and it's the publishing house who determines what happens. For example, the Anselm Kiefer, I was not going to use endnotes at all. I was going to let the reader do the work, but Seagull Books has marvelous editors, and they both helped and encouraged and did a lot of the heavy lifting to elucidate the rather cryptic allusions often. The other solution that I think is preferred, in my experience, by British and American publishers is what they call the hidden gloss. I just finished a translation for an Australian publisher of a novel set in East Germany a month before the fall of the wall. And the author will mention newspapers and radio stations and all these words that a German reader recognizes right away, whether it's East or West, whether it's straightforward, whether it's dissident, whether it's someone who's in line with the government or against it. And I actually had a long discussion with the editor about how to deal with this, and I said, I have to put in a hidden gloss for some of these. So, this magazine would be read by an East German, or this radio station is sort of the German version of Voice of America. And he said, okay, but keep it minimal. So I was allowed sometimes 2 or 3 words briefly in the text. But then I got into a discussion in Germany when there was a forum with the author and a dozen of his translators into different languages, and I explained the strategy, and someone in the audience stood up and was absolutely livid with me, and he said, you can't do this, you have to leave the text as it is. I mean, he was so angry, he came up to me afterwards and harangued me for a good 15 minutes, and I tried to explain, it's the publisher really who has the final say, but that didn't placate him. So people feel strongly about that issue.
Do you hide or declare your gloss?
It's the same in Italy. Usually it's the publisher who will tell you, okay, don't use any footnotes, endnotes, no glossary, so you have to find a way. And if there is something which must be explained, I use this kind of intra-translation. I just add 2 or 3 words to explain. Of course, asking the publisher first. And I think that endnotes and footnotes break the rhythm of reading, of course. And sometimes they may distract the readers as well. I personally, as a reader, I love footnotes and endnotes, whatever, glossary. But when I translate, I try to reduce it a lot. And now, in this age, everything can be looked on the internet. And if you have enough curiosity, you can search. And so,
actually, can I add one thing? And that is 2 of the very best publishers of translated fiction in the United States have adopted that problem as a marketing strategy. So they will find a prominent, well-known name, writer, to write a foreword. And that foreword often sells the book. So it's both speaking for the text as a text, but also setting it in context. And so the other one is Yale University Press. They will also, along with Archipelago, another fabulous publisher I did the Maya Haderlap for, they will allow you, sometimes encourage you, sometimes require you to write a translator's afterword. And there you can, lay out a few of your insoluble problems and at least get some comfort that if it didn't make it in the translation, at least the reader will have a sense of what they're missing.
Can I just say something too? I think there are books which really needed to have a translator forward, but again, this depends on the publisher. There are some books which are so difficult to translate, and when you read the English, you say, oh, I wonder what will happen to the translation. Also, as a translator and also as a reader, if there is a foreword, it's very, very useful, because sometimes you are translating from Jamaican English and the story is set in Jamaica in the 70s, and I was reading this book and I was saying, oh, and then I read the Italian translation, which was brilliant. but there was no forward. And I say it's a pity because the translator did such a great job and such a great effort, of course. So that's useful, I think, especially with some novels.
Clara, I'm also going to ask you whether your work as your projects as a translator, I mean, have they somehow found a home in your other life as a poet and a novelist? And what sorts of effects might your work as a translator have on your own literary practice?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. At the beginning, when I started writing, I was so influenced by the authors I was translating, and it was very bad for me. But I was just starting writing in their style, which wasn't their style because it was my translation style. Then after a while, but that was at the beginning, I was very young, it was my first experience. After a while, now I'm two persons. One is the translator, one is the writer. Of course, there are influences and things are merging, and my Indian experience is in my Italian writing. Now I realize that when I write in Italian, the reference, I mean, everything is Indian in a way, but it stays Italian. It's very funny. It's a pity that you can't read Italian, but it's like this. And I think now that after many years, my experience as a writer and a reader, first of all, I'm a reader, it's helping me a lot with my translation activity. Maybe I'm more confident and I know how to approach a text. And in writing, I mean, everything is there. And of course, it comes from the books I translated as well.
No, I asked this also because you'll know the project, Modern Poetry in Translation, MPT, which is a Penguin series, which for the first time brought to Anglophone readers, definitely in India, a sense of what was happening in, say, Eastern Europe or in Latin America. But the language that Ted Hughes and Danny Weisbord, the idiom that they produced, the spare, elliptical kind of poetry that they produced, actually had measurable, if you will, effects on a whole generation of poets writing here. I'm thinking of Arun Kolotkar particularly, to pull one name out of a hat. So it's, translation can somehow have that effect. And Tess, I'm going to ask you whether it's whether your engagement with certain kinds of cultural contexts through what you translate or certain kinds of writers, how is that, this is a kind of abstract question, how is that perhaps influenced the way in which you look at literature in general? I'm thinking here of the corpus of reviews and essays that you've written over the years, which are a considerable body of work in their own right. So could you speak to this?
I think that for me, getting involved in translation and having to immerse myself in the specific contexts and cultures that these works come from have made me a better reader on a granular level. It's unfortunately, it takes the joy out of reading a little bit because I feel compelled to figure out everything that I might have read and sort of half understood and thought, I'll make an X and I'll get back to it later. But now I kind of want to reach for Google right away. So it's disrupted the flow of my reading and a bit the joy. But on the other hand, it's opened up new levels of the texts that I read. And it's also made me more attuned to the way language is used by the writers. Again, I go back to the voice, which is equally abstract. The voice of the writer, of the text itself, because some writers write with different voices. So sometimes it really has a very sort of muddling effect on me, but then once I get caught in the text, I find that I can immerse myself more deeply. Crawling back out is the problem. So it's shrunk my overview, but it's expanded the microscopic view.
Yeah, it's like having an expanded vision that now when you read the text, you have several layers. And 20 years ago, for me, it wasn't like this. It was just a book, but now there are layers and layers, and it's different in a way.
And believe it or not, we actually have arrived at round 6 as promised. And I'm going to sort of... it's been an amazing conversation, but I want us to maybe dwell a bit now on the possibility of the translator's role as an activist. And I'm saying this particularly because of the kind of cultural and historical and political moment we're in. But could we think of the translator as an agent of cosmopolitan openness and of cultural confluentiality in the kind of world we're in, which is dominated by xenophobias of different kinds, by annihilationist, identitarian agendas, extreme populisms, and I'm thinking here of what might seem like a completely utopian project, which was Weltliteratur, which Goethe floated in a series of writings that he did. And you know what? It remains an inspiring idea that someone could step out of the comfort of their culture and their language and speak of how, I mean, Goethe says this at some point in the 18th century. He says, I think national literatures are finished. This is my rough and ready translation of what he actually says, but he says pretty much this. And he speaks of being open to the writings and the thoughts of foreign nations and how these might come in and that sense transform an originally national self. So could I invite you to talk about your own experiences in this way, and what are the extra translatorial projects, if you will, that you might undertake, not only in the text, but what else is there that a translator might do as an activist?
I have to say, I think on this front, Goethe was wrong. The Weltliteratur does exist, and it's the community of readers who read beyond borders. But this discussion was revived recently in the New York Review of Books, where Tim Parks, a noted translator into the Italian and also critic, novelist, made the claim over several articles that writers were increasingly influenced by the international publishing market. Writers like Murakami or Peter Stamm, a Swiss writer, were writing with the idea that they wanted a broad readership. So writing with their translators in mind, so that this transition would be seamless. On the one hand, it's true. Murakami has admitted in print that he thinks of translators when he writes. Peter Stamm, I'm not so sure. Peter Stamm happens to be a writer whose books are very psychologically based, and so he addresses rather universal themes. That his books could happen anywhere does not mean that books with a lot of local color and context aren't being written. I think that Tim Parks just didn't take the trouble to find out what's going on, what's being written in various languages, because it's too hard. I mean, in Austria, you have differences in every one of the provinces. You can read the differences in the text, in the preoccupations, in the historical influences and the historical matters that these writers address. And you read it, you open by page 3, you know that it couldn't be set anywhere else. It's the same thing with the Swiss, where they not only have German, French, Italian, Romansh, but they have so many dialects that were up until quite recently only oral, but are now being written down with various codifications. I had a very interesting experience where there is a Swiss writer who writes in Berndeutsch, so the particular dialect of Swiss German spoken around Bern, completely incomprehensible to somebody who only speaks High German. But he had on the stage, he read the Berndeutsch. It was translated into High German. It was translated into French, Italian, and the English translation was done into Glaswegian. And actually, the Glaswegian is the only one that worked. I know enough Italian to at least get some sense of it, because the point wasn't the story. The point was the music of the dialect and the particular terms and the sense of humor and the way they interact and what it means to speak dialect to each other. So in this case, it was fortunate that English, doesn't have many recognizable dialects and fewer with the homogenizing effects of television. But in Glaswegian, it worked. And this is, I think, the strongest counterpoint that I could offer to somebody like making the argument of Tim Parks is that there's a flattening of world literature. There isn't a flattening. There's just a lack of interest by publishers in getting books that are, bound to only sell 500 copies out there. But there are these, Don Quixotes of literature who are doing this. You just have to be patient. And in terms of activism, I think now more than ever, translators, not necessarily translators from French and German into English, but translators between languages and also into English from the smaller languages or regions of conflict are important. I'm on the Penn Translation Committee, and we mounted a campaign to free a Turkish translator who was imprisoned ostensibly on espionage and militating against the government, truly because she ran a Kurdish newspaper. And she's a 70-year-old woman, she was absolutely harmless, but we were able, by galvanizing translators all over the world and making a public outcry, to at least get her removed to house arrest. Since Trump has tried to ban immigration from 7 countries, a number of publishers have stepped up. Small publishers, it's true, but they've stepped in. They said, for this coming year, we will only publish translations from those 7 countries. And that kind of cultural diplomacy, it's invaluable, right? Because it's going to humanize these people who are being I'm not going to go on a political rant, but they're being demonized, and this is one effort to humanize them again and give them a face.
I think that translation can be a kind of revolutionary act. And in the case of Italy, Italian is a kind of monolithical language for some reasons. And all these translation from, not only from English, mainly they are from English, but also from other languages. It's a way of opening up eyes and opening horizons for us. And also the thing I notice in Italy, the language now is changing. Italian language is changing to the immigrants. And the first generation immigrants now are starting to write in Italian, and the language is flourishing again. It's just, at one point I think the situation was quite, not dead, but almost dead. And now there is this new thing, so this is really good. And translating things for a nation which is not so keen on learning other languages, it's vital, I think. It's just essential. Otherwise, there is no communication, and it's really a bridge among cultures. So,
which brings us to the moment where we could invite questions from our colleagues across the strip of grass. If anyone has questions for Tess or Clara, that would be great. And if we have Indira, is there a mic that can travel? Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you for a wonderful session, most edifying. Thank you. My question is, I think, I have a little comment and then a question. Apropos Heimat, there is a word in Indian English, at least in the South, which is a native place or native. So, you talk to someone, where were you on your holiday? Oh, I went to my native. So it was just a little comment to throw out to you. I was most interested that you were an editor in the beginning, and that sort of led you into translation. So 2 questions. Were you an editor of translated works, or were you an editor in a specific language? And second of all, I just wanted to make the sort of extended comment that I run a short story magazine, and we publish a lot of work that's translated from Indian languages into English. And when we're editing those works, I have to be extremely conscious of the fact that I'm not necessarily hearing the rhythm of the language in the original. I mean, when it's in a language I know, I can sometimes go back and rather laboriously read the original text. And so I wondered if you had any comment on editing translated work.
Right. I worked in a publishing house that published half and half, translations and English. Because the translations that they did were mostly from French and German, because, to be honest, that's where the funding is, and so that's why most are from French and German. I had access to the original language, and so it changed the way I edited. When I edited a work in English, I took a lot of things for granted that I always questioned with the translation where I could check. I'm not sure that's a good thing, because a translation has to work on its own. And my experience as a judge of, I've been on the Best Translated Book Award and the Penn Translation Award for half a dozen years. And we have to judge books that are translated from all sorts of languages, from Tamil, from Finnish, from French, German, Spanish, obviously. And so there's an ongoing discussion with the judges always. What do we do when we know the original language? Should we go back and check it? Because we can't do that for 95% of the books that we're judging. And people have different ideas. I have to say I can't resist the temptation. And if there's a passage that bothers me in a book I'm judging, I'll go back and look. And sometimes I say, oh, wow, they really dealt with that well. So I have to give you an inconclusive answer, which is, it's the art of the impossible. And I hope to hear and find, and as an editor, recapture the rhythm and sound if it's been lost in translation. But you settle for what you get.
Hello. My question is for Clara, because you said you often translate Indian works for Italian audiences. I was wondering, how do you decide what to translate? Is there a particular kind of genre of Indian texts that are more popular in Italy to translate, or do you decide, or does the publisher decide? How does it work?
At the beginning, 20 years ago, it was easier to propose a book to a publisher. I was traveling in India, loving a book, and I say, okay, I'll try to have it translated into Italian. But now this is not possible anymore. So mainly big publishers have these agents, so they buy things in bunch, and then it's not always the good authors they choose. But before it was easier. It was the translator who were choosing their authors. Now it's more mainstream literature getting translated into Italian, unfortunately.
I would like to expand the question of Indira and ask, how is it, because you spoke about the going back to the original language, and how is it to go back to the writer or to the author, be it Anselm Kiefer, who you could have asked, or Peter Stamm, who you could also have asked, or you can ask. Yeah.
Mostly, it's been a good experience. There are a few authors who simply don't want to be bothered. Anselm Kiefer wouldn't even answer letters from the publisher, so it was not an option to contact him. So I would say that 75% of I've contacted 75% of the authors that I've translated. Of that 75%, 90% have been a joy to work with. And the other 10% think that because they can read English, they know what, and so they will try to coerce, suggest, bully me or the editor into choosing something that they think is right. There was one author who I've since learned, and I no longer send my drafts to authors. Even if they ask for it, I might send them, a paragraph with a question. I would have to go through the exercise of, they would say, well, why do you use this word? So I would go to the entry of the, Oxford English Dictionary, I'd cut and paste, I'd send them, and I'd say, because this is, meaning 3A, and it fits in the context, and it was too time consuming. But that's a danger with translating into English. You probably don't have that.
I don't have this problem. Yeah. And for me, it was always useful when I was in touch with the authors, because, for example, when I was translating Everest Hotel by Alan Seeley, it was so difficult to understand some references to the Himalayan landscape and flowers and all these things. And at that time, internet was not so common. And for me, it was really important to be in touch with the authors. And in other cases, of course, Italian is not so known like English, so I probably have more freedom. And all the authors I've been in touch with were very nice. And when I was translating Life of Pi, I remember that Jan Martel put in touch all his translators. So I was working with the Spanish one and with the French one, which are similar to Italian in a way. The languages are very similar, and that was really, really useful, because I was feeling that I could have references and help if needed as well from other translators as well.
Any change or evolution in your style of translation since you began your journey?
Yes. it's totally different now. I think it's different my approach to translations. At the beginning, I was a bit insecure, and then you need to have a kind of background, and now it's easier in a way. And of course, the language is changing every time. So I think it's a kind of you have skills. Okay, you have it, but then these skills get better every time. This is my experience.
I would say that my translations now are much better than they were before, and it has to do with confidence and experience. My earlier translations were much more literal, much closer to the original, which probably created some unnecessary stiffness or awkwardness. So I could hear it when I read it back to myself, and I always read my translations out loud because that's where I catch the most mistakes. But now I'll feel more free in departing from the immediate sense of the text, and to catch the larger spirit, or, not worry so much, I guess, feel more free to employ an idiomatic expression, idiomatic approach to the text rather than a strictly literal one.
Well, we've
Translators in the room, I think.
Yes, there are indeed, and readers. Tess Lewis, Clara Nobile, I want to thank you both for the generosity and intensity with which you've engaged with these questions. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a really, I think, productive discussion, and I hope this carries forward as we go. And in 10 minutes, some of these questions will be back in play because we have two teams of author and translator, Ravi Shankar Bal and Arunava Sinha, and Vivek Shanbag and Srinath Perur. And that session will be chaired by Sampurna Chatterjee. So we'll all be back here carrying these discussions forward. But for now, thank you very much, Tess and Clive.
Thank you.